Hi, Martin from Gemini Walk and Talk here, and I wanted to talk about a controversial topic. Can the USA actually annex Canada? And this was brought up and the internet is buzzing because the new president-elect of the USA, Trump, who's also an old president of the USA, he said in a meeting with Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, that the USA may have to annex Canada because Canada is receiving subsidies, and if Canada cannot sustain itself without US help, it might as well become the 51st state, which, you know, it's a dig. He obviously is making fun of Trudeau. He's kind of trying to assert dominance over him in his characteristic way, but it got people talking, which is really the important part. And so that's why he did it. So, you know, it's at first when you say it and you hear that, you're like, whoa, that's crazy talk. You know, that's obviously cannot happen. Canada is bigger than the USA, second biggest country. On top of that, the two countries are allies and part of the same so-called rule-based order, which means we don't annex each other, right? We don't invade each other. And we also, with Canada, have the whole trade agreement, which was called NAFTA. It was renegotiated and renamed, but it's one of the top trade agreements in the world. Among the most trade in the world happens through the US-Canadian border. So disrupting all that sounds like too much and crazy talk. And therefore, a lot of people are sneering and laughing, and, you know, there's logic to that response. But then the Canadians themselves are like, hey, wait a minute, that's not funny. It's a very rude joke to make in front of our Prime Minister that you will annex us. But when they act like that, you know, obviously they're offended for a reason, but there's actually a bit of fear there, because it is a lopsided relationship, and that's Trump's point, is that the USA is so much bigger, the USA carries the economic weight for a large degree. Canada is actually struggling. When you look at Canada, I live near Canada, it's right over there, and in 2 hours I can get to Canada. I go to Canada every year. I really like Canada. I really like Canadian people. I think they're very nice people. They're also highly educated. In fact, they're very, very similar and close to Americans. There isn't a huge difference, and some people may take offense with that, but when I cross the border, I can talk just fine, I can get along with people just fine after living in America for this long. So I think the countries are very compatible, and it's a small difference going from here to there. But there is a difference, and it is a different country. It is a sovereign country. It has its own laws, it has its own everything. And yet, most of its economy actually functions as an extension of the US economy. For the most part, Canada is an extraction economy, which means they go out into the north where the vast wilderness is and it's too cold to live, and they have huge resources there, whether it be lumber or oil or metals or other things. They extract them, and for the most part, they sell them to the USA. At least that's the biggest business model and the biggest consumer of it all, the end goods. You know, they basically sell raw materials. And for the most part, the USA, you know, it's a huge country. Canada actually on the map is bigger, but Canadians basically live on the American border. They're basically lining the border for the most part. There are some that live a little farther north, but almost the entire country lives on the border with the USA. And when you think of it that way, almost every Canadian lives closer to the USA than to the rest of Canada, because it's like a thin populated line this way, but north there's almost nothing as far as population goes. And therefore, for every Canadian, it actually matters more that they are trading with the USA than it may matter whether they're trading with each other. And when you think about it that way, Canada actually is the most disjointed country in the world, because to get from like here, where we are in Washington, Seattle, nearby is Vancouver, Canada. BC is on the Pacific Ocean, and it's something like 5,000 miles or kilometers away from the capital, Ottawa, and where Toronto is, the biggest city. It's so far, while Seattle is only 2 hours away. It's what is it again, 100 something miles, I believe. So That means for all Canadians, they are so many more times closer to Seattle than they are to Toronto and their capital, Ottawa. And then it makes you wonder, then why do they pay taxes to Ottawa and so on, and why their finances are ruled by Toronto when their actual proximity and trade is with the USA for the most part. And so when you start analyzing the situation, you start realizing that it's not so absurd when you start talking about Canada becoming part of the USA. And the other thing is that Canada is not very stable politically. At the moment, they have a very unpopular government. And the reason is they have been impoverished very much. If you look at the GDP per capita, something like 2012 or 16 or something, it was almost the same as the USA. And now it's much lower than the USA. So the US economy is like taking off while the Canadian economy is stuck. And they have not gotten any richer. And at the same time, prices have gone insane in Canada. And I'll talk more about why that is. But now it is so expensive to live in Canada, while there actually isn't that much work. They don't have that many good companies there. And I've heard some staggering number of companies are now leaving Canada and coming to the USA. They're moving their whole operation because there are better opportunities, better taxes, better laws, better regulations. And Canada is rapidly impoverishing now. It actually, of all of G7, or basically the most advanced economies in the world that have had problems since the financial crisis a while back, Canada has impoverished the hardest. And it's gotten to the point where it's actually very, very difficult to afford life in Canada now. It's hard to get a good job, which even covers the cost of living. And for that reason, the government is very unpopular. And not just that, but Canada has a degree of separatism, political separatism, because of Quebec, which is French. It is part of what was French Canada, and all of Canada at once was French. Then they fought a war with the UK. The UK took it over, but French people remained in Canada, and they fought for the right to have some degree of autonomy. And I believe they can even trigger a secession clause. And because they can, so can any part of Canada. And now we get to the interesting part that the most prosperous part of Canada is actually near here, Alberta, which has oil reserves and is extracting them. And ironically, again, America buys almost all the oil and even extracts it. It's American companies that own the rights and that are running the operation for a large degree. And that province is actually the only one that has a good economy, and they are actually not happy at all that they're ruled by Eastern or Central Canada, which is taxing them and writing laws against them, actually making it harder for them to take advantage of the oil and many other things. Another huge reason for things being unstable in Canada is that they went really crazy during COVID with the lockdowns, and they destroyed the lives of people, businesses. There were so many protests and just a horror story there. And now many people are very unhappy about the situation in Canada. And we have Alberta, which is the most prosperous, transfers money over to the federal government, and the federal government basically actually does only things that are bad for Alberta. And so if Alberta, and they talk about it too, Alberta constantly talks about increasing its autonomy and more going its own way. Well, they don't say the word secession maybe fully, but that's really the end goal there, or the final state of that. And there are precedents for that. For example, Texas was part of Mexico, and Texas said, we don't want to be part of Mexico anymore. We are seceding because it's not a good deal for us to be ruled from Mexico City. We're too far, we're too big, we can live on our own better. Then lo and behold, something like next year, Texas joined the USA, and makes you wonder if that was always the plan. So what happens if Alberta says, we're done with Canada, we don't get anything good from this Canadian government, it's only bad, there's a total economic crisis, politically all the laws are against us, we have the rights to get out of it. And then what happens if they do? Well, they are splitting Canada in parts at that point, because here, British Columbia next to us will then be cut off from the rest of Canada. They would have a massive state like Alberta in between. And south is the USA, and north is basically Alaska. There's Yukon, but there's almost nothing in Yukon. And so you will have then BC, which becomes orphaned. Why would BC continue staying in Canada in that case, when Canada is actually thousands of miles away and the USA is only just a few hundred miles? Therefore, BC has a major incentive at that point to also part ways. And BC is also very prestigious and nice place, but more than that, it also has the ports for the Pacific Ocean. So then if BC is to leave and potentially try to join the USA, because why wouldn't they? And BC itself is interesting because the whole thing is mountain pretty much, and virgin forest and just glacier. But the populated part of BC is tiny compared to the whole state, which is huge. And so you're talking about a little strip of land populated next to the border of the USA, thousands of miles away from Canada. Alberta wouldn't be part of Canada anymore. And so there's no logic to them staying in Canada whatsoever at that point. And then that means Canada would lose its Pacific presence, its Pacific ports, its Pacific coast. It will no longer be a Pacific country. And that is extremely hard loss for the central government of Canada. They'll be so diminished. They'll lose the oil in Alberta, and they'll use the coastline on the Pacific. But it doesn't end there, because when you have Alberta leaving, possibly BC leaving, there are two more states. I think they're called Manitoba, and another one, is it called Winnipeg, or is that a city? Can't remember, but it's in the middle there, very cold, Great Plains. But those two states together, they're also kind of agree politically with Alberta and not with Ottawa or Toronto. And what they may choose to do is the same. And they actually have among all, or most, of the fertile agriculture land of Canada altogether, and it's a huge amount. So if they leave, they again have major incentive to join the USA, because with that much farmland and other resources, it is the USA which is the buyer of them. The trade relationship with the USA is what matters to them by far the most, much more so than staying within a sinking ship, which is the Canadian economy. And so at that point you have four huge states with all the oil, all the farmland, and all the Pacific coast parting ways with Canada. And again, it doesn't end there, because the original reason Canada has a secession movement and some sort of autonomy clauses like that is Quebec. Now, why would Quebec stay if half or more of Canada has already left? And they will probably also say, we go. Whether they become truly autonomous or join the US, who knows? But if they are to leave, that carves up Canada even on the east coast, because they're east of the central part of Canada. And then there'll be other orphaned parts of Canada, like Newfoundland and Labrador, or whatever they're called. And so then all of Canada gets carved up, disjointed. And the central part of Canada, which is Toronto, on the Great Lakes, and there's that canal there, I forgot its name, St. Lawrence maybe, I don't know, I'm kind of reaching. But the canal is how you get to the sea. But that part of Canada is actually more so, it's south. It's actually south of Seattle. It's kind of into the USA. It's like carved into the USA. So it's for the most part actually surrounded by the USA. It's like a peninsula that goes in and near Niagara Falls and so on, and that whole Great Lakes area. So you will have a situation in which much diminished Canada, only its core truly remains kind of embedded into the US territory. And from every direction, there's either secession or America is absorbing it. Meanwhile, the Canadian economy and central government will be failing even harder at that point. And then you start wondering, what is it all for? Let's just become one giant country with the USA, we'll all be prosperous, we'll all be together, we'll all be strong. We have all the resources we need, all the manpower we need, all the capital we need. We have more freedom that way, more prosperity. And so it really makes you wonder now. Now, all that I described may not be known by the average person, but it is very well known to people that deal with this type of subject matter. And obviously, this is exactly why Trump made that comment, because he senses this weakness. And it's been known, if you listen to think tanks, to people who write books on geopolitics. And so Trump knows this, the Canadians know this, and they are afraid because of that. And so when Trump said it, what he does is called opening the Overton window, meaning something that you may think is taboo or crazy or not to be talked about gets brought up, and all of a sudden now everyone is talking about can the USA annex Canada. And I don't think that means, at first when you think about an annexation, you're talking about rolling in tanks with manpower, and you look at Canada, it's enormous, the population is sizable, like 40-something million, even though the USA has a much bigger population of like 340 million. So America has something like 300 million more people. Then when you start doing the math of how much more militarized the USA is, I mean, it's likely that the USA could actually defeat Canada militarily, and that's possible. But that's not what would happen. What would happen is, like I said, previously happened with Texas, and the situation I described can actually lead to the dissolution and absorption of Canada into the USA. So it's not that far-fetched. And if that is to happen, I will explain what kind of a situation we'll be looking at in a second here. So if such scenario does occur, whether it's far into the future, you may think it's far-fetched, but if it does occur, and again, Canada is failing very hard at the moment, and if it doesn't get it together, it may actually fail completely. Being so close to such a powerful neighbor, there's a lot of leverage and incentive for Canada to join. Now, if that happened, what would the world or the country look like? Well, it would be an absolute beast, because the USA is already something like the third, fourth biggest country in the world, depending on how you count, and Canada is the second. If the USA and Canada joined, they would be the biggest country in the world, and they would have enormous amount of resources. Both of them are packed with so much oil, lumber, metals, just everything. And it would basically be continental scale. It would be an entire continent united almost. Yes, Mexico and Central America are also part of North America, but the giant, fertile, and temperate landmass is actually within the USA and Canada, and it gets smaller and smaller as you go south, and it gets tropical and desert. And so because of that, you would basically have most of the good parts of the USA as one country, one government, one power, one economy, everything. And such a country, you already see how powerful the USA is when it comes to just kind of a small department somewhere in Washington, D.C. has a pet project to overthrow a country, and then you see a massive calamity somewhere in the world just because of that. I know the USA has so much power, it can just affect the entire world. Now, what happens if the USA more than doubles in size? It absorbs another 40-50 million people in its population and has as much resources as Russia. All the metals and the oil and energy and everything else. And controls 2 oceans effectively, and basically can sway the politics of anyone in the world. It can dictate the trade of anybody pretty much. It will get really crazy. And so because of that, it would be very much the most significant geopolitical event of recent history, probably since World War II. And it would mean basically a new dawn, a new era. And a lot of people think that the USA is in decline or something, the whole West is in decline, etc. But that would mean yet another 100 to 200 years of US domination. And I'm going to make another video of whether that is really true, whether the USA is in decline and falling, or whether the USA is actually still on top and will remain on top. But for this video, I'm focusing on Canada, and the absorption of Canada would mean that the biggest possible geopolitical win for anyone is happening, which would be the USA to absorb all of Canada. And in that case, nobody will be able to rival the USA. You know, you talk about so-called BRICS bloc, you talk about the European Union, you talk about China on its own. Nobody will be able to at all be a rival to the USA. Even, you know, China had the Soviet Union that dissolved, and now it is having a hard time defending its prior territories, truly. You know, Ukraine was part of Russia effectively for so long, and now they're having to fight a bloody war for 3 years already to make sure that Ukraine does not join the US and its bloc, which is NATO and Europe, etc. So what we're talking about is all these people or countries, they're actually going to be in a much more unfavorable position against the USA when it comes to world power. And yeah, on the other hand, it would be better for the citizens of Canada primarily actually to join the US. But even for the people of the USA, it would be better if the Canadians join, because the cultures are compatible, they will be sharing resources, sharing the economy, sharing markets, sharing currency, sharing everything really. And we all at that point are beneficiaries. Typically, bigger labor markets, bigger trade markets are good and raise prosperity. And when prosperity is rising, also normally freedom rises, because it's hard times that lead to authoritarian situations normally. So it would be good to actually perpetuate the kind of prosperous middle class that the US has and that Canada used to have before it failed, because Canada, it isn't able to sustain its middle class anymore. When you talk to Canadians, when you watch their videos on YouTube, when you listen to their economists, they are no longer able to be living a middle class life. And buying a home, if you're on a middle class wage, is completely impossible. While in the USA, it is still possible actually. Still the best affordability in the world. So if you're Canadian, honestly, you may have some kind of national pride, but it's actually completely in your interest to join. And why not? You know, you get so much out of it. You may think, oh no, but then we'll be ruled by the US political system, which, you know, is a giant clown show. Yes, but it's performing better than yours. And so do you want your current failing regime that you have, or do you want the one that is succeeding more than any country in the history of the world? That's the question. And I think as America continues rising, which it will, because at the moment America is really, really strong economically, and Canada is actually faltering completely. And the more that keeps happening, the more it becomes an obvious choice for them to actually choose to join America. And if such clauses exist within their constitution and government, why wouldn't they take advantage of them? Why would you live in Canada and say, what I'm hearing there is like, you go to work and you cannot even pay your rent and afford food at the moment. That's for the most part the life of the average Canadian. Why wouldn't you then decide, hey, you know, when I cross the border, half an hour from my house, everything looks fine. I can work for good money, I can find a job, I can afford to have a house, I can afford to eat, I can even retire and have a family. You know, it becomes a no-brainer. Be like, what is pride when it comes to not actually being able to afford to live? I would choose to be able to afford to live 10 out of 10 times when it comes to that. And then you can say, you know, I'm biased, I am an American effectively, been here a long time and I'm an American citizen. Yes, and that is for a reason, because this is a successful place. You can look at all the statistics, you can look at all the accounts coming out of Canada, and you will understand that the degree of success and failure has diverged majorly. And that will get worse and worse because Canadians' economy is completely hollowed out. They have blown an insane bubble, like a real estate bubble. They can't afford homes anymore. And if the prices of the homes come down, the entire economy goes bust. It's that bad. Like 2008 in the USA is nothing compared to what they've done in Canada. And their prices never came down. In the USA, they did. And so we had good affordability since 2008. And they never did. It only got worse and worse and worse. And it will continue getting worse until it crashes and burns. At that point, they have to very seriously ask themselves, maybe we should take them up on that offer and become the 51st state, which again is a joke because it won't be one state. There'll be some kind of agreement, etc. There'll be multiple states and whatnot. But, you know, food for thought. It's not that outlandish. It's actually a very interesting thought exercise when you think about it. Okay, see you next time.